Hey there, friends. Welcome to the Being Brown and Bold podcast. I'm your host, Jess Thomas. We're so glad that you're joining us for all of our amazing conversations about stepping out of our comfort zone, being bold, and taking chances. Today, I get the chance to hang out with Lisa Mattam, founder and CEO of Sahajan, which is the leading Ayurvedic clean beauty brand. Since its founding in 2015, Lisa has grown it into a global force with an international presence. In 2023, she spearheaded Sahajan's global partnership with leading luxury hotels. That means if you stayed at the St. Regis, the Ritz, JW Marriott, the W hotels, you would find her skincare products there. It's in over 400 properties worldwide. And in 2024, Sahajan launched at Sephora Canada, which is amazing. And it's actually Sephora's first Ayurvedic skincare brand. Under Lisa's leadership, Sahajan has repeatedly been recognized for its excellence, most recently receiving awards such as the 2023 Cosmopolitan Clean Beauty Award and a 2023 Oprah's Daily Editor's Choice Award. Both Lisa and Sahajan have become media fixtures, featured in outlets including Vogue, PopSugar, Glamour, and so much more, including Forbes Magazine that called Lisa a pioneer in the beauty space for bringing Ayurvedic beauty to the forefront. Previously, Lisa spent over a decade working in pharmaceuticals, which inspired her dual approach to Sahajan, blending clinical science with the power of Ayurveda, an integral part of her South Indian heritage, which is why I'm so excited to have this conversation. And also outside of work, Lisa lives in Toronto with her husbands and two children. So she is momming, she is leading, and it is just amazing that I get to have her here on the podcast. So Lisa, welcome. I'm so glad to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure.
So to get started, I think South Asian names are so important. And could you tell us a little bit about your name? Like, your name is Lisa, my name is Jessie. And I think sometimes people look at us like, but what's your real name? And so first name, last name, how to pronounce it, what it means, and then also how you got the name Sahajan.
Yeah, absolutely. So I say my name is Lisa Mattam, but if you were in India, in Kerala, better pronounced or more appropriately pronounced would be Mattam. But I grew up always saying my name was Mattam. And although my parents moved here, so my dad moved here, right before my sister was born, he obviously, as I think about it, anglicized the name because he would go by Mattam at work as well. But in Malayali circles would go as Mattam. I'm really proud of my heritage. I'm really proud of our name. It was interesting for me. I took my kids to India for the first time last year. And even though they don't necessarily share my last name, it was amazing. And this experience of being in Kerala particularly, because there's so many small shops, there's different things, they would see the last name Mattam or Mattam all over the place. And so they would see like the Mattam Bakery and the Mattam Hotel. And now as sort of architecture has evolved, a lot of people have their surnames in front of their homes. And so it really elicited a really strong sense of pride for me. I think having grown up in Toronto, I think you and I are of the same vintage where there was no one else with my last name ever growing up. I didn't have any relatives or cousins on my dad's side till I was much older that were living in North America. And so I hold actually my name really close, which is why I never changed my name. I actually was like, it sounds a bit silly, but I was thinking of getting I don't even know if I'll get a tattoo, but I was thinking if I did, it might be like Mattam in Malayalam. But then I also laughed at myself and was like, do you really need to write your name on yourself?
Same.
But I have a very strong affinity to my name. And it's actually something I've talked about with my kids because they, once asked why I didn't change my name. And Mattam is one of their middle names because it's important to me that it holds strong. And so, yeah, my name is very special. And to your point, I think for those of us who are from Kerala, we have maybe names that sound traditionally less Indian. Same perspective. My middle name is Mary.
Me too.
Oh, really? Yeah. Same with my daughter. Yeah. My middle name's Mary. My mom's name is Mary. I think it's a real reflection of our heritage though. And it's a real, I think, reflection of the Christianity of our heritage as well. So I'm very, very proud of my name. Sahajan. So funny story of how we named the brand is naming is actually a really big process. because you want to have a word that's inspired, but you also want to have a word that's trademarkable. There were a couple of names along the way that I couldn't trademark. One of which I still thought was beautiful, was the name Monsoon. And I remember being a kid and going to India during monsoon season, and I just thought Monsoon was such a beautiful name because, it's these heavy rains, but you need the monsoons to bring life. I just thought it was such a beautiful metaphor. But there's a UK company called Monsoon, and so they own the rights everywhere. But what's interesting is we created a series of words. Intuitive was one of them. And translated into Malayalam, and I had them translated into Hindi. It would have been great to have had a word in Malayalam, but because of the intonation of Malayalam and the way that sometimes it sounds and pronounces, it's a gorgeous language. It's one of the, I think National Geographic said it's the hardest language in the world to learn, but it is a hard language if it's not your mother tongue to even wrap your head around. So the words, I would have words like monsoon, or I would have words like, intuitive or clean, and they would translate into these very, very, very long words. And so Malayalam words didn't hold true, but there was one word, intuitive, translated into Hindi, was Sahaja. And so I thought that was just so beautiful and really reflected the inspiration of the brand. And then when I was working with the agency on what the logo would look like, it felt like it was missing something on the end. So quite literally, I added an N, and that was the word.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Okay, rewinding. When your kids saw Mattam, on billboards or stores, did they ask if your family owned like all those things?
Yeah. So I believe, from my observation, they got a really interesting sense of belonging in India, which is something I didn't expect. And not that I don't think that they felt like they belonged here. There was a very interesting sense of belonging because all of a sudden you're in this place and where everybody looks like you, everybody, right? Not just like some of the people look like you, everybody looks like you. They've always grown up pretty close to my parents, but we lived with my parents for a year and a half when we were renovating. And so they got even deeper into sort of the day-to-day life of what my parents' life was like. And so whether it be like my parents' faith, you can't not know my family without knowing faith. And so, but they could see it sort of in a much larger display. And I think they could put my dad into context. I think they could put me into context. And then to your point, seeing the last name around, I think it made them feel like they were part of something bigger.
Yeah.
I thought that was an unintended, but such an extraordinary outcome from that trip.
That is beautiful. That's so neat when we can see our kids looking at things with a fresh perspective, especially if it's something that's really important to us. And like you said, it wasn't like you were expecting that or looking for it. Yeah, I love that because they catch things when we raise them that we may not even realize. And to like watch that, that's amazing. Tell me a little bit about yourself. What does it mean to be Lisa?
Oh, that's a really big question.
It is.
What it means to be me, I think it means, ultimately, I think it means that I'm on a journey. I was born into, parents who were incredibly supportive. They had their ideas too, and they, were strict in certain ways, but they were very, very supportive. And I realized as I became an adult, like if I could see far, it was because, I stood on big shoulders, and parents, and then, we're certainly the place for that. And I think throughout my life, being me has always been an evolution. So, I work hard to try and, be a good person, be a person who's contributing. Having grown up in a family with faith, such a big part of my life. I think fundamentally, when I look at my life, am I doing well by my family? Am I doing well by my kids, my parents? Am I being a great friend? Am I striving hard for my potential? Am I working on my wellness? And am I always pushing myself along my journey? I think that's really what it's about.
And I think often moms especially kind of lose that in the working, taking care of kids. And it's so important to not lose that, but to really know who you are and how you got here and what's important to you. So I think that in itself, I even think that's kind of bold because I feel like we inherently are just told as women to take care of everybody and do all the things for all others to the neglect of ourselves, right? And so to know that about yourself, it's also modeling for your children. This is what it means to be the individual that I was called to be, that I was molded by my family and circumstances to be the best that I could be. So, but I know it's also not easy, right? It's a whole journey.
Oh, and I'm a big believer, like my best could look like different things on different days.
Mm,
I laughed about this with a girlfriend last night, like through grad school and when I was first working, I worked in pharma at the early part of my career. I taught fitness, like fitness was such a big part of my life. And yesterday I was like, oh, I should go outside. I haven't, like I was working, so like I was like heads down working on a couple of things for the business. And at like, I don't know what time of day it was. I think it was like 3 p.m. I was like, have I been outside today? Which is not
mm,
cool. Like it's actually
yeah, right.
not good for your health or your wellness or any of those things. And so I went on a long walk and I was, kind of saying to myself, I need to be more disciplined with my fitness. And so I think as mothers, as you say, like I think we have to give ourselves grace that
Mm,
our best might look different on different days or at different times in our lives. It's not losing sight of that.
right. Now, you talked a little bit about your cultural heritage. And for people who don't know a lot about Kerala or even Ayurveda, how has your cultural heritage informed your work and your life?
Oh my gosh. Well, I never thought that I was going to be an entrepreneur, but it's funny that now as an entrepreneur, I'm leveraging something that's so inherent in my culture. So it's funny. So how has it informed my life? So, you and I are both hail from the same part of India, from Kerala, which is the southernmost state in India, a really unique state. I think, we like to boast as Keralites or as Malayalis of our high literacy rate, a state that really, I think, prides itself in its educational system. From a gender equality standpoint, I think we see in Kerala particularly an advancement of women that sometimes we don't see always across India. Growing up as someone who grew up very close to the Malayali community, my parents were really involved. I went to Malayalam church, regularly. I almost every week for certainly many, many years of my life. We danced Bharatanatyam and we did all things Malayali that families did. And so it really informed my life because it was such a strong part of it. I grew up with parents who were very comparatively very liberal. And so I was allowed to do a lot of things. So, I went out with my friends and I now realize like I have friends who are like, we always wish we had your parents because you could go to school dances and tell the truth and you could, do
Yeah.
all of these things. And I was like, oh yeah, I didn't realize, not everybody had that. So my parents were very liberal, but I think this strong sense of pride that my parents gave me both about my family and my culture definitely led. I mean, Indian culture in general is very education focused, but I think we see it a lot more we see sort of a predominance in the South that's unique. The emphasis around school was so important. My parents came to this country so that I could do more. I really felt that expectation and that need to fulfill that. I don't know, want to call it an obligation, but I felt that growing up. And then as I pushed on, it's interesting because I think, my parents wanted me to be a doctor. That was certainly their goal for me. And it was, they tried very hard to ingrain it when I was a child. And I think one of the biggest clashes we ever had is when I finally was like old enough to throw down the gauntlet and say, I'm not going to do this. And I think they just thought they could like navigate me or like, I remember when I was like, I'm not going to do this. And my godmother called and everyone was like, well, we could, send you to med school here, or, if you want to go abroad and it was like, and I said, it's not about the location. You have to know that it's not something that's for you. Through my career, once I was like, okay, I know that this isn't right for me, I had to start finding what was right. And I used to joke with my parents when we would have this conflict about becoming a physician. I used to say, well, fine, I'll be a doctor. Like as if you could just turn on a light and become a doctor. But I used to say, fine, I'll do it, but I'm going to become the CEO of the hospital. And I didn't even know what that meant. How I saw myself was in a leadership role. I remember in my head, I saw myself like more in a business suit than I did in a lab coat, but I didn't grow up around that. And so I started to navigate on my own. I did an MBA. I worked in pharma, as I said. And then the inspiration for the brand was really unintended. So I grew up again, a very Malayali house, but also in it, like my dad was progressive, but also I'll say spiritual. So what I mean by that is like he meditated. I think, managed a lot of the things as like a newcomer through learning other practices. So I used to come down in the morning and my dad would like be lighting a candle and praying and journaling. And he would sometimes have us like chant when we were stressed out and all that kind of stuff. I've always had that sort of wellness Ayurvedic lifestyle, all of those things sort of in the background of my life. And then what happened was when I was pregnant with my second child, I came home one day, I was a consultant. So I worked in big pharma, I worked in consulting, and my daughter had been playing with my skincare and she had it on super thick. And it was like so cute. She had it on her face and her arms and everything. And I remember her being so proud of herself. And I looked up and I was like, oh, you're so cute. But in my head, I was like, I have no idea what the ingredients of my skincare are going to do to your young, beautiful skin.
Right.
I remember going to her room and saying, like, you've got to take this off. I kind of took her by the hand, and my parents had just come back from a trip to Kerala. And so my dad had brought back these oils. And, many families in Kerala have plantations, right? Have a property. It's a farming community. And so he even had like coconut oil that was from his house. He had said to me, use this on the kids, like that kind of stuff. So I was like, if you want to play with things, this is what you should be playing with. And so it was in that moment that I was like, I don't think my skincare is good enough for her. It probably isn't good enough for me. But if this is what on gut instinct I believe in, I need to go back there. And so it sent me on a bit of a journey. One, to understand that what I thought was like family tradition or being Indian was quite steeped in the science of Ayurveda. So yeah, I don't know if you knew Ayurveda growing up, but I didn't know it as a word or a terminology, as a lifestyle. It was sort of incorporated into things that we did. So my dad never let us drink cold water. He always had this thing, like you couldn't drink cold water. They oiled our hair. And like, I remember when I first started breaking out in high school, he would put turmeric on it, but he never used those words. When I started to do, a little bit more thinking, and I was like, oh, all of this comes from this old world science that's Ayurveda. And then on top of it, that Kerala is the epicenter of Ayurvedic study.
Right.
It's really what I started to understand. And it's interesting from a historical perspective. When the British came to India, Ayurveda had to go underground because they wanted to extinguish it as a medical science. So that's how come like the majority of Ayurvedic practices in Kerala. There's Ayurvedic retreats you can do all over the place, but the real sort of heart of Ayurveda is in Kerala. How it informs my life now is so tremendous, because I know being Malayali informs my personality. I know my culture informs a lot of the decisions that I make. When you grow up in any culture, whether it's Canadian culture, because I know there's things that are probably uniquely different between you and I, because I'm Canadian and you're American, but there's, a unique set of rules and practices that I probably carry into my life from being Malayali. But then it truly actually informs my day to day. It is the inspiration by which I start the business. So I think in some ways, it's a bit of an homage to my parents. It gives me a connection point to something to which I hold truly valuable. And then I honestly, in my heart, I believe in the transformational power of Ayurveda. I think we're seeing it in the wellness movement that, people are talking about the value of spices. We're seeing so much of our culture reflected in wellness. I think as those of us who grew up with it, it's an incredible privilege to be able to be part of the movement that brings it forward to people.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And I did not know the term Ayurveda growing up. But yeah, I had my hair oiled, and I'm in the culinary spaces. So all of our food always had, I don't know how many spices in it, like 10 spices minimum. And only later am I realizing the properties of each of those spices and how healthy they are. So I teach chai classes, and it's kind of my entry point for people who are not familiar with India or spices in general, and what each spice is for and how to make your chaya. I even teach, most people call it chai tea latte because of Starbucks, but that's not even the name. And it really depends on the language, because in Malayalam, it's chaya, and it's cha in Punjab, and te or tetani in Sri Lanka. It's even called different things. But I think it's so important that we reclaim what was ours to start with, and to hear your journey with that. It's just so beautiful and meaningful. And I'm glad this is what you stand for, your company stands for, your products. And I can just picture, did you get a picture of your daughter when she had like all her makeup? Because it's probably before.
No, because it was like so in the moment that I didn't.
Yeah.
But it's funny, actually, we found a photo from around the same time where she had taken sunscreen and done the same thing. So
with all the white cast.
Yeah, with all the white cast. Yeah.
So when you were little, what did you actually imagine your life to be like? Because I'm guessing your parents, when you were born, like, this child, it will be, Dr.
It was like, the child will be a doctor. Again, my parents are incredibly supportive, and they nurtured so many of my interests that it's funny. I think they thought like, we'll nurture all these things, but this is where she'll end up. And so, they were really open. I remember being in high school and like wanting to go to France, for a week. And they were like, of course. And, and
Wow.
yeah. And
With them or without them?
without them. Yeah. 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 My dad was very encouraging of things. Like I can remember running for student council president in high school. One of our family friends calling my parents and my mom and saying like, this is a bad idea. She shouldn't do this. She should be focused on her studies. And
Oh,
my mom came down the stairs while we were like making the posters, and my friends were over and we were like making the posters. And she told my dad, and I could understand. She was like, oh, so-and-so auntie says this is a bad idea. She should be focused on her studies. And my mom was a little bit more easily influenced. So I think she was like a little unsure. My dad was like, forget them, where she's doing what she's meant to do. But I think it took me a while to really see myself. Like when I worked in pharma, I never thought I would be an entrepreneur. So I think what's been interesting about my journey is that when I was younger, I didn't actually explore a lot of what I wanted to do because my parents had such a fixed idea. I excelled. I did like debating and all those things in high school, and I really loved it. And so I thought I wanted to be a lawyer, but they had such a fixed view. That was when we had a bit of conflict. It was after that I was like, no, I think business feels right for me. And so I did an MBA, and then I worked in sort of bigger pharma and specialty biotech and worked in consulting. And this was sort of, again, unplanned. I think what's amazing is because my parents gave me a lot of support and self-confidence. I remember when I started this business, a girlfriend of mine saying to me, like, you really think your products are going to like sit on this shelf somewhere beside Estee Lauder? And I was like, 100%. Like,
mm,
or else I would never do this. Like, you
right.
have to have that kind of blind, sometimes, lunacy when you're an entrepreneur, because if you don't believe it, then how is it ever going to happen? And how are you ever going to get there?
That feels really ambitious. I think to have that vision, then you have the drive to get to it. Because I think
Mhm.
of myself, I'm like, wow, I don't know if I would have been that confident to say my end goal of what I envision happening. I'm not a good visionary. I'm
Oh,
a
you
good, I'm
probably
a
did.
good,
And I think I'm a little cuckoo. Like I remember her saying that to me, and it was almost like she threw out a challenge because I was like, well, why would I do this if I just wanted it to be small? Because
yeah.
it's so much work. Why would I do it? And so, yeah, I was like, yeah, for sure. I think I can do that.
Yeah, well, I know that you mentioned your parents' support. And yeah, when you say liberal, I'm sure people are like, that doesn't feel liberal. That feels normal. I'm like, oh no, for us, that's
Yeah, that
really,
feels like what I mean is like feels liberal about it is I think we grew up in a community that has very sort of set views. I had a family friend who visited my parents recently. She now lives abroad, and she was always like, oh, I always thought your parents were so cool because you didn't lie to them like about a lot of stuff. And I was
yeah.
like, yeah, I never thought about that much. But like Carol's also a bit of a conservative culture, right? It's evolved now and it's evolving, but it isn't what people perceive Indian culture in terms of like Bollywood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Mhm.
know even with my parents, they were also the liberal ones, meaning like they let me go away to college and stay at a dorm 4 hours away, and nobody had done that before. So they were like, wow, you're letting your so then they just assumed I must be going to an Ivy League school because why else would you send your daughter 4 hours away? And I was like, I'll just let them think what they want to think. But my grades in high school proved I would never be pre-med. So I think that dream died for my parents a long time beforehand. But I went into mass communication, advertising, PR, which was unheard of.
There's so many strong views of like what good looks like, right? It's like you be an engineer, you're a doctor, you're all of these things.
So with your Malayali friends, cousins, whoever, did they get you? Like, did you fit in with all of them? Because I feel like the way you viewed things, your life and your ambitions is not typical. So did you feel like maybe you didn't fit in because your dreams were different than all of them?
It's a great question. What's kind of cool about my cousins is that many of them have gone on to do like really interesting things, right? Like there's teachers in our family and social workers, but also like one of my cousins is right now an up and coming writer director. And, that's not what we came from or grew up with. She did journalism at Northwestern. And, one of my other cousins is like lives abroad now and is like quite senior in the Peace Corps. And in a lot of ways, we've all sort of gone off the beaten path amongst my family friends or like our community. Sometimes they may have felt a little different, but I think again, it's finding your people. Like even something I tell my kids is like, you grow up and as you go through life, you meet incredible people, but as you evolve through life, sometimes you meet more your people, right? So
Mhm.
it's finding, so I had, a really good a Malayali friend growing up who we were much more similar. You gravitate to the people who I think get you.
I know growing up in our area, our families came from Kerala or other parts of the world. Like a lot of them left Kerala. Like mine actually were in Calcutta and then Delhi and then got here and somewhere in the Middle East. But universally, it felt like the whole focus of your life is your vocation and your marriage. And
Yes.
then we were told, okay, don't date anybody, finish all your education, then you get your job, then you can think about marriage. And then perhaps you may be able to choose your spouse, but don't spend all your time dating. If you meet somebody, just marry them right away. So this is how it was in like our area in New York. I know that my Canadian cousins did not quite have this, a little bit of it. Does any of this echo with your story?
Oh, great question. So I would say, again, this is where like, yeah, people probably think this is normal, but like feels liberal is I can remember there was this Malayali convention of sorts and like they were talking about dating. Actually, it was like one of the topics. And I
Wow.
remember they were asking parents to like say when they would let their kids date. And I think it was like 16 or 18. And my dad raised his hand and he was the only one. And
Wow.
everybody was like, what? And all my friends were like, you're allowed. We didn't have such a strong message around marriage in my home. But I know that a lot of my family friends did. My parents were more about like go to school, get educated, start your life. I think my dad saw that he had two daughters and he wanted us, regardless of what we do, to be able to live a life that we didn't have to depend on someone to create the life that we wanted. And I think that was
Right.
a really strong emphasis. I got married in my early 30s and I had gone on a trip. It's funny, there was a huge gap where I didn't go to India, but I had gone on a trip right before I met my husband. And I think I was like 30, maybe I was 30. And my aunts and uncles and cousins were kind of like, so like you will get married, right? Like, we were in India and I was like, yeah, if the right person comes. I would say there wasn't a strong emphasis in my house that
Mhm.
has to. Now, mind you, I do think my dad breathed a sigh of relief when I did. And I think we both felt, my sister and I both felt this sense of like, go study. It's very vocation focused in my house.
And you've talked a lot about the faith of your family. So for you, this is how you grew up as well, and you got to be part of this community. How has faith or your belief system informed your outlook in life?
Oh my gosh, my faith is such a big part of my life. And I think what's incredible, and I don't know if you feel similarly about this, but I felt like what's incredible about growing up as someone so I'm Catholic, and there's a strong Christian community in Kerala and a strong Catholic community in Kerala. But I think our parents, having grown up in India, I believe makes them very open to so many other religions, right? Because if you go to India and if you go to Kerala specifically, there's a church and then there's a temple and then there's, a mosque and I don't know, maybe I'm biased, but you feel the presence of Christianity when you're in Kerala. But if you actually look demographically, there are more Hindus than there are Christians, right?
Right,
But you,
right.
you really feel Christianity when you're in Kerala.
Yeah.
And so I think what's been beautiful about that is that my faith is really strong. I grew up in a family where faith was really important and spirituality was really important, but that respect of other faiths was also there too.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I have, Sikh friends and I have Hindu friends and my best friend from university is Punjabi, he's Sikh. And, I've been to the Gurdwara so many times with her. And I actually very much can find peace there because early on came to the belief system that God speaks to us in different ways. So I think it definitely informs my outlook on life. It definitely is something I turn to for strength and resilience during tough times. Growing a business is phenomenally hard. And it certainly challenged me to to the edges of my comfort zone. And I've needed my faith.
Yeah. Well, I think what's interesting in colonialism, I would say, you were saying they kind of try to stamp out Ayurvedic practices. And I think some people would say, like, I remember hearing this early on when yoga came to America or got popular in America, that it's mutually exclusive. Either you're going to be like following this Christian faith and disregard all these other influences. But I too remember like the concepts of Ayurveda being in our home, but nobody called it that. So if somebody came to you and said, well, how can you do Ayurveda? You're like Christian, you're Catholic. How can you do both? What would you say to them?
Well, one, Ayurveda is not a faith, it's a practice of life, right? I
Yeah.
think the biggest part of it, right? It's this lifestyle system that you can dip your toes into every day, however deep you want to. So something as easy as adding like lemon to your water or drinking warm drinks over, those things can make a phenomenal difference on your health and well-being, and they require no faith. And then I think the other thing is to your point, like, so it's funny. So I grew up in the Catholic Church. I also took Bharatanatyam, which is like a classical Indian dance, and I had just looking because I'm looking at my desk because I think it's here, but I have this little statue from India of Lord Shiva. It's like the dancing statue that a lot of people, our priest bought that for me when I was a teenager, when he was in India. So like, I think that we grew up in in an environment where, again, these things are not mutually exclusive. And practicing yoga, if you look at what the true practice of yoga is, yes, there's the physical benefits, but there's the mental benefits as well. And, my faith believes that those mental benefits or those prayers or all of those things happen in their own unique ways. So I don't think that they're necessarily in opposition to each other. And neither are they mutually exclusive, nor are they, I think that they're complementary. So the practice of Ayurveda in itself, I think if you're debating it, would be more like, can you believe in Western science and Ayurvedic science? Which to me, the answer is a really easy yes. And Kerala is a really good example because there's a huge hospital in Kerala that has medical doctors as well as Ayurvedic practitioners. And so it's a good example of how those two can fit together. And having come from pharma, I'm a big believer in medicine. And so, there's a time and a place for everything. It was really interesting to me. I have a good friend from undergrad who was Hindu Punjabi, and he came to my parents' house. It's a very Kerala thing, but my parents are part of like a prayer group. And so they would meet once a month, and very Catholic, there's like a statue that moves with it, so it like stays in your house for the month and then it goes to the next person who's going to do it. And it's all Malayalis that are doing this prayer group. And he was at my house and he was like, man, you guys do Catholicism like you're Hindus. And I was like, what? And I was like, what are you talking about? And he was like, look at the statue. And when I looked at it from his lens, big statue of Mother Mary.
Yeah.
And she's got a big flower garland over her. And she's got these little incense things beside her. And I was like, oh my gosh, it looks, if you were to go into a temple, it looks the way that you would adorn or revere a Hindu god. And what you realize is that those influences are there. Yes, my family, I'll speak for my own family, but my family and our extended family and my parents' family friends are practicing Catholicism in a very true form, but there's going to be Indian cultural influences in there in the way that they do those things. If you look at what a rosary is, which my parents pray the rosary every day, it was initially it was inspired by the mala beads that we know from Buddhism and Hinduism.
Yeah.
And so I think we fool ourselves into thinking that, these things are mutually exclusive when in fact they're so beautifully complemented.
In fact, I went to a Syro Malabar service. It was actually a baby baptism. And as I'm watching, like they have the elaborate robes and the decorations, and then my brain is going to the Old Testament and how God had instructed the building of the temple and the decorating of the temple. And when you read those details, it's very ornate. So I'm like watching this and I'm thinking, I think we got these traditions from Syria, which came from Jerusalem. I think it's all like connected. So there has been a disservice when colonists have come in the name of the church and took away the cultural aspects to have a pure form of faith. Like, actually, if you go back to the traditions, it's much more sensual. Like all our senses were meant to be part of worship. Same thing with Ayurveda. Like these are gifts from God, the herbs, the seeds, like all of this, and they're all natural that have been given to us. So there's nothing that's non-Christian or about it. Right?
It's agnostic, right? It's not about a faith. And if you want to be able to take advantage, because there is a link obviously to Hinduism, but if you want to take advantage, I've worked with an Ayurvedic practitioner and there's like I don't know what the right word is. I've lost the word in my head, but something that she would recommend that I do. And it's really about like how within your hand you can do everything, right? Like you have the ability to transform and create and do all these things. All of these things exist within your hand. As a Christian, or as the way I was raised, was like you have like the elements that are within you, and then you have the faith part, like you need to rely on God. But again, those two things aren't mutually exclusive. Like you can learn and adapt. My best friend from high school is Filipino, and so we both went to Catholic school together. But when she got married, they did this thing called candle, cord, and veil, which is the way that is part of their wedding ceremony, right? They're still Catholic. We're still Catholic. Somebody who's in Italy is still Catholic, but it's their culture showing itself in their faith, which I think is incredible.
Right. I'm watching your life and listening, and it feels like you do a lot. How are you making sure that you are taking care of yourself, your marriage, your children, your friendships? It feels like you have a lot going on.
It's a work in progress. I feel, to be honest, like I go through phases. I mean, like many people do, the lowest on the totem pole sometimes feels like it's me. I don't know if the kids would agree, but it feels that way. I mean, one of the amazing things about entrepreneurship, I work harder than I ever have. I work crazy hours. There's no limit. I mean, I think the world post-COVID has also allowed people to have more flexibility in general.
Right.
I think yesterday as an example, my calls ended around 5:15, and then I needed to drop my daughter somewhere. And one of my advisors was like, hey, can you catch up? And so I talked to my advisor the whole drive there. And then I took my daughter to her appointment and I sat with her. And then I dropped her to soccer. And then as I was leaving soccer, like again, one of our investors called and I talked to her the whole time back to my house. And then my husband and son were somewhere else. And so I actually went for like a long walk and talked to her the whole time. And then I drove back to soccer. So it feels a little crazy. If I'm doing these things at night, it allows me to be like, I have to go pick up this or do this or whatever. I try really hard. My kids are the first loves of my life. Like they're the most important. So what's hard is sometimes work does take priority, but I also think that's part of life. It doesn't mean, I think that they're the most important people in my life. There's no doubt about that. But sometimes you need to be able to flex. And so it's hard. It requires constantly evolving the way that you do your routine. It involves giving yourself grace for when you're not perfect. I would love to spend a little bit more time on me and sort of my own wellness. I mean, I think self-care is important, but I need to be more disciplined about like the gym and working out and those types of things. But it's also at the end of the day, I just want to like lie on the couch.
Right. Which I think is also taking care of yourself because you are rested.
Total. And sometimes you have to do, that's what I mean. Like sometimes like your best is that's your best, right? It's like I've worked all day. I've made sure that we've done the things. I also think we live in a society where if we want to try and have it all, quote unquote, we have to recognize that we need to put a lot of supports in place. So when my kids were younger and when my parents were more able, they were very involved. And, I remember they would come over once a week and they would pick up the kids from school and they would bring dinner and they would do their thing. And I would just stay at work till like 9:00 at night. And it gave me that one night where I could just like blow through working, but it also like, who better to be with your kids and your parents, that kind of stuff. Right. So, and I think now that my kids are older, they don't need that, but maybe we need other supports. And so it's starting to build in those supports.
Okay. I could talk to you forever, but we need to eventually get back to our regular jobs.
I was like, I'm kind of like, part of me is like giggling because I'm like, I hope the people on the podcast, like maybe it's good. They feel like they're listening to two girlfriends, even though you and I have never talked before today.
Which is wild because I feel like, oh, I totally click with you. And you know what it is? I think also as I've aged, another thing that has really become important to me is having meaningful conversations with people that I click with. And that's kind of one of the reasons why I started the podcast, because I invite people who I think that I would click with. We may never meet, although it's been so fascinating, the number of people I've been able to meet in person that I had on the pod, because everybody pretty much on my podcast, I've met through like Instagram, except maybe a couple. But then when they meet each other, so I was just at this fancy food show and like 2 or 3 of the podcast guests were all there at the same time. So it was fun to like have everybody together. Going back to our Malayali background, do you have a curry leaf plant?
It's funny. I do not, but I feel like I need to have one because it's funny that is a question because I feel that I need one.
Yeah.
Not necessarily just to flex, but to feel like, but I do have a limca in my fridge. Should you drop by?
Oh, yes. I will take a limca. In fact, I just had a guest a couple of weeks ago. They make adult beverages with limca as their like date night at home because they can't go out as frequently as they'd like. So they'll do a date night in when the kids are in bed. And limca is the star feature of their adult beverage.
Really?
Yeah.
My other 2 cents, because I really believe we should always be promoting South Asian businesses, is if you're in New York, there's a place called Kolkata Chai,
Uh-huh.
and they do incredible chai and different stuff, but they also do like a masala limca. That's
Really?
yeah, like they add spices into the limca. It's really good.
Oh, that I never would have even thought of that. This whole limca thing is like blowing my mind because limca is my drink of choice if I go to India. But with the curry leaf plant, part of it is the flexing. Like I'm an adult in a South Asian household, therefore I have a curly leaf plant. So all three of my kids, like that's how you know that you've like made it because none of us are ever going to speak Malayalam well. If you can make like some sort of Indian food, like sambar, if you can make sambar and you have a curry leaf plant, a curry apple plant, okay, you have succeeded.
Oh, it's funny because I can't make sambar either. That's like one of my, I had this plan when like everything shut down during the pandemic that I would learn how to make Kerala food. And then it just quickly became me eating more of my mom's Kerala food.
Because we live far from family, the only way to have Kerala food, because you can't even buy Kerala food. I think the closest place is like 5 hours away in Atlanta. So the only way to eat it is if I make it. So I actually have made sambar that I am proud to serve. And a lot of people who say they don't like Indian food, it's because they probably had North Indian food at local restaurants that's been Americanized. So
Yes.
I will make dosha and sambar or Italy. I'm not a big Italy fan because I don't like the sour fermented taste. That's why I like crispy, crunchy dosha. But I make it and I will make the sambar almost like a thicker vegetable stew with more of the lentils. And then the people are like, oh my word, this is amazing. This is Indian food. I'm like, it's Kerala food.
I'm I'm already like making a mental note that I'm going to message you for the recipe because my I need to learn how to make it and my mom is not so well and so she
Mm.
won't be able to teach it to me and so I need to learn how to make these things.
Yeah. And part of it is, your taste. Like every mom makes it differently. And like,
Part
you
is
know,
everyone makes it differently and I think I will get a curry plant and then you can come and visit and
yes.
look at it.
Too bad we don't live close enough. I actually, when we have baby curry plants growing in the pot, I like redo it. And then when I nurture it, I give it away. And so two of
You're
my
like
podcast
a
guests,
real
I've given,
hardcore. That's like what my dad used to do. That makes you like a
yeah,
hardcore family. Like when
thank
you're
you.
sharing your pineapple plant, like then you're really
I've arrived.
yeah.
Okay, if you had to choose what beverage, if you're relaxing, would you want? Chaya, tea, we talked about coffee, Kerala style versus Western style, or is there another beverage? What's your go-to?
So I don't drink coffee or tea here. If
Mhm.
I was in Kerala, it would be Kerala style coffee, which for the people who are listening who haven't had Kerala style, it's like very milky and very sugary. As you go
Mhm.
further down south in India, the coffee gets sweeter and sweeter. So I'm sure it's like diabetes in a cup, but it tastes so good. That would be my choice. If I could make that, that's what I would make.
And is there something you would like the listeners to know if they are hesitant about making a bold move?
I would say do it. You know, one of the things we didn't talk about was the jump into me starting this business. And I'm really proud of the things we accomplished, like, first Ayurvedic brand at Sephora Canada and the hotel amenities partnership. But people are always like, oh my God, you've done so much. And I'm like, yeah, we're like a real 8-year overnight success. Because I've been working on this for a long time.
Right.
And when I first made the decision to do this, I didn't tell almost anybody. Like
Mm.
I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell like the vast majority of my friends. My husband knew, and I think he's always been very supportive, but I think there was a tiny part of him that was like, really, we've got a good life. And I kept it really quiet until really close to launch because I didn't want to hear any negativity about it. I didn't want to hear anybody tell me it was a bad idea. And I didn't want anyone squashing that. I'm not saying you need to live like that, but if you want to make a bold move, but my advice would be is like, do it because there's never going to be a right time. If you're a mom, there's never going to be a right time. If you're worried about like where you are in your career trajectory, now is always the right time because it's the time that you want to do it. And you have to go and you have to go in with both feet in and it's like a wild ride. And so like the journey's not easy and it's not perfect. It's incredible. And that bold move doesn't have to be entrepreneurship. I mean, it can be many things, right? It could be what you said, moving halfway across the country. It could be just doing something that feels like it pushes you out of your comfort zone. But I think that the beauty of life is that if it doesn't work out, you just go back. You can just change course again.
How much did you really lose by trying? Whereas if you never tried, you always wondering what would have happened.
Mm-hmm. And I very little regret in my life about anything, right? And so not everything worked out perfect, but if you don't try, I think it's easy to live in regret.
Right. And I think failure is part of that journey. Like if you don't fail ever,
there has been a failure on this journey, if the specific entrepreneurship journey. And if we didn't, I don't think it would be a business.
Well, do you have anything coming up that you would like to share with the listeners?
Oh, thank you. No, this is a really exciting time for the brand. I mean, the Sephora launch was huge. We're growing also really quickly in the US. Our online business is killing it. So we just launched an eye balm that has ghee in it, like 2 weeks.
Wow.
I'm so biased, but it's so good. Exceeded all my expectations. It sold out in like 10 days. Luckily, we were able to get it back in stock super quick. I think, what I'm really excited about is like the growth of the business. But when we talked earlier about being able to bring things forward, like ghee actually isn't inherent in South Indian culture. Although when I was in Kerala, 2 times I went to 2 different people's houses and they gave me ghee rice, which is like a new thing. It's like a dish in Kerala. It's called ghee rice. You should, if you Google it, it actually says from Kerala, which is funny. There's a lot of ghee, but I love that we're able to take these ingredients that come from India or the Indian subcontinent and really demonstrate their abilities. And so that's what I'm excited about.
Yeah. How can people find you?
Yeah, you can find us at sahajan.com is probably the easiest because no matter where you are, you can find us online. If you're in the US, we also retail at Credo Beauty in the detox market. And, in Canada, obviously Sephora. And hopefully, you and I talk again and I'll keep telling you more places.
Yeah, that's amazing. Lisa, thank you so much for joining me. Just hearing your story is so inspirational. And I love meeting a fellow Malayali who is doing what you were designed to do. I feel like you're totally living out the way that you were called to be in this world.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thanks for having me.
That was such a fun conversation with Lisa. And even though she's all the way in Canada and I'm in the US, just such a connection that we have. If you have not heard all of our other podcasts, they are equally inspirational. So make sure you are subscribing. We are on Spotify, we are on Apple Podcasts, as well as here on YouTube. So thank you so much for joining us. We're going to have another amazing conversation next week. So till then, be wise and be bold.